Hi, and welcome to SAP Now Virtual Experience. My name is Bo Bade Peterson, and I'm part of our Center of Excellence for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. During this session, I'll be taking you through how your company can secure itself against cybersecurity attacks. We will show you in SAP how we can respond to and neutralize cyber attacks and coming up with the right mitigation actions to prevent these attacks from happening. I hope you will enjoy the session, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those in the chat below. I'll also share my contact details with you in case you want to reach out after the session. Thank you very much for joining. All right, so let's get started on this cybersecurity and data protection session. And what we're typically concerned with within the SAP landscape and infrastructure, right? So on one side, we're looking at cyber risk and governance. We have application security, we have identity and access management, right? And we have data protection and privacy. So how do we secure the crown jewels within your ERP application? And then we can spend time on cloud transparency and control, but let's focus on the four upper topics. So cybersecurity and kind of the governance around that, right? So how do we document and monitor certain types of risk, and what are the risk responses to that? How can we align the risk, right, with the controls that we've already had, and make sure that they're aligned with the business objectives, right? So how do we ensure that business is not disrupted? How do we make sure that certain types of controls are actually being formed, and those controls will meet, let's say, regulatory requirements and so forth? So that's kind of the cyber risk and the governance side of things. And then on the other side, we have, application security. So how do we monitor the actual application and make sure that we don't find anomalies in terms of user behavior, right? So typically, we would see a certain change in a user's behavior if that user has been compromised and is being used for a cyber attack, right? Or we can even look at specific transactions and say, how have the business transactions changed in terms of, the frequency that they're being completed in, or even we could look at amounts for I don't know, procurement and so forth. So there's a lot of different things that would tell us something whether or not our system has been compromised or not. And if somebody's trying to do something that either side would disrupt how we're operating or manipulate the data, or even committing actual fraud within our business applications. So we want to focus on, let's say, the monitoring side of things and making sure that we can get a pre-warning and react on that in due time for that to not become a full-scale catastrophe for our company. Then, of course, we're looking at identity and access management as well, right? So how do we ensure that people are who they claim to be? And especially during these times, right, where we have a lot of people working from remote. So on one side, we want to make sure that, that they can work, but they need to work in a safe manner, right? So are they, or should they be able to see the same data at home as they can from the office, right? And how do we make sure that they are who they claim to be? So if we're just relying on user ID password, well, is that secure enough, right? Because we don't know if they're logging on from a company delivered laptop. So maybe we need to put a certificate on to make sure that that laptop is recognized when we do the authentication. Maybe we need to, enforce two-factor authentication because they come from an IP outside our company network and so forth. So we have different measures we can put in place to say, okay, from an identity and authentication perspective, we know that the users that are within our corporation, that they are valid because they're still hired, that they might be accessing our data from a non-company provided network, but we have two-factor authentication in there and so forth. So we need to make sure that we have, let's say, the right security measures to allow people to come in and actually work and operate just as if they were within our office premises in a secure way. The last thing is around more, data protection and privacy, right? So how do we ensure that the data that they can access is protected in the right way? We can either mask that, or we can even, unmask it based on certain types of consent, so the user can provide a legit reason for why they need access to certain types of data, right? So this would all be, let's say, preventive measures for, if somebody would go in and try to launch a full-scale attack on our infrastructure and our data within the SAP infrastructure. So let's take a closer look, like in one of the key applications that we have. So we're looking at enterprise threat detection. Now, enterprise threat detection, I won't say it's a new kid on the block, but it's definitely a newer application within our governance, risk, and compliance portfolio. We have 150 customers or so running enterprise threat detection that we know of, live in the system. And the key thing here is that we are able to actually perform real-time security monitoring of the SAP application and look at the different types of events that occur and put those into a certain, let's say, correlation of events and determine if those correlated events are actually resulting in a security pattern that we feel uncomfortable with and we can react on. All right, so we can analyze that data. Now, if we look at the features and functions of enterprise threat detection, on one side, we have the forensics analysis and modeling, right? So we can look at all the information that's available. We can determine what types of patterns we want to launch, and we can present those in different types of dashboards. And I'll show you one in a second as well. Then we have the automatic execution of attack detection patterns. So once we've defined a pattern, it will continuously monitor the application for that specific pattern, and if we find the pattern, it will raise a flag and say, hey, here's something you need to look into. Right, so we would have the real-time alerting whenever something occurs that we want to be alerted with. We do real-time analysis, right, and investigation, which means once we see something, we can actually analyze that and investigate. We have all the information readily available because that's been compiled by enterprise threat detection. Once we have that information and we can make a decision on that, and we can look at, what are the correlated events, right, from different log data. So we can even see if a person has entered through the main gate, swiped his access card, logged onto the desktop, right, and then from there launch different applications of what he's done, as long as we have the log data underlying and supporting that. So it's an efficient way of actually looking at data, and even more so, we can enrich that data because we're taking the different information from different sources and putting it all together, right? So I would have, the user's MAC address, his first name, last name, phone numbers, email addresses, what system he's got his accounts on, and so forth. So I have a lot of information that I can put together, and I kind of can build the story based on all the different data points that I've compiled. So that's the main, let's say, functionality of enterprise threat detection. Also, what's important is within enterprise threat detection, we do user pseudonymization, right? So in essence, I'm taking a user and then I'm pseudonymizing him so that when we do the forensics analysis, nobody knows who the person behind that user ID is because it's been pseudonymized. Once we have, let's say, probable cause that somebody has happened or something has happened that might not be legal, then we can dissolve or resolve who that person behind this ID is, and then we can, process it further. Now going forward, so how does enterprise threat detection actually capture all of this information? Well, we take the different logs, right, from different systems, and once we have that log data, then we would assess and process the log data and put it into the enterprise threat data scheme, and that could be SAP logs and it could be non-SAP systems as well. But the whole idea is that we take this SAP HANA smart data streaming, and during that process we actually normalize the data. So what does the normalization mean? Well, it actually means that so what does normalization of data actually mean? Well, it means that we actually take data from different sources, and once we have the data, we look at what is in the actual log. So let's say you have a Microsoft Active Directory log and you have a user logon. Well, that might have certain or one specific attribute within that log. If you do the same for an SAP system and you have a user logon, you might have a different entry in the actual log for a user logon. So what enterprise threat detection does is that we normalize that, right, in terms of giving it a semantic that's understandable by non-security or SAP specific professionals. So you can work with enterprise threat detection without having detailed knowledge about SAP specifically, because everything has been normalized and given a semantic that's understandable by I would say almost any user out there. So the semantic model actually ensures that we have different attributes that can be kind of put into the right context, and make sure that everything that is interpreted is put into the right category, right? So you can further process that going forward. Then, of course, we have some level of log management, right? So we keep the original data, and then we can normalize that data, right? So if you do some data scheming, then you can rectify that going forward. But once we have all the data set up, we have the normalized data in the HANA database. We do the monitoring, right, of the different events, right? So you can create your own, let's say, security operating command center monitoring view, different, screens. So here we actually have 6 screens in total, but you decide on what should be on the different screens. But we can also monitor, let's say, the system landscape. So we can look at, the different systems that we have, the different applications that we have running in the SAP landscape, have we actually applied the correct patches, and are you using the functionality in that system for which a patch would be required from a security perspective, right? So, but in general, what is it that we actually scan for? Well, it's everything from different types of authorizations to specific function module calls that are, let's say, unsafe. We can even look at debugging. We can look at denial of service. We can look at ABAP downloads and so forth. So what's interesting here is this is the enterprise threat detection launchpad, and as you see, there's different tiles, right? So depending on who you are as a user, you would have different, let's say, capabilities within the system. So I'm an administrator right now with the demo user 01, but now I'm going to log on to the forensic lab. So the forensic lab is where most of, I would say, of the cool stuff happens within enterprise threat detection. So initially, as you see, we have a workspace. We're looking at logs for the last 15 minutes. Over here, we can see the different systems we're looking at. We can look at the different logs that has been, let's say, used for this system, and we have the different events, the semantics down here. So if I select the semantic, right, and I say, okay, I want to look at I don't know, something like user logons, right? I can simply right-click on that, and then, as you will see, once I've right-clicked on it, I can add that to the path, right? So it goes over to the left, and then all of a sudden, I'm filtering the current events based on all the events where we have user logon, right, as the common denominator. And I can see within the last 15 minutes, I've had one event where a user has actually logged on to the system. So then I can decide to actually change, let's say, the pattern, right? So in this case, I'm going to do a small edit to this, right? So we're looking at, user logon failure, but I want to change that, right? So I can look at, what do we have in the knowledge base that comes with a solution, and then I actually look for something, let's say, data download, right? So in this case, I want to create a new pattern, and I want to create that pattern based on a new alert that I want to see. I want to see, all the users that are downloading stuff from the application. I'll show you later why this could be of interest, right? So I put in data download from the knowledge base, and I say, this is what I want to look for. So the next step now is to say, well, once I have the data download, what is it exactly that I would be interested in? Because a data download by itself could be anything from downloading a certain invoice to maybe outputs from a table to different things that would make common sense, right? So maybe I could put in let's just for this demo at least, say we'll do it for a certain limit, right? So let's put in a threshold. So we can say that for this specific data download, what if the resource size is above a certain threshold, right? Then it might be of interest, right? So let's say somebody's trying to I don't know, dump a list of prices or customers or vendors or suppliers, right, from our system. Then we would expect that to have a certain minimum amount. So we put in 2 megabytes for this to see what is the actual data download size, right? And then once we have that in there, where we can say, well, now we're looking at data downloads. We put in the timestamp for 15 minutes. Maybe we want to change that because we want to have it, let's say, more current. But now I can actually create a pattern based on these 2 filters. I can have more paths if I want to, right? I can make it even more complicated, but very. So now within the solution, we can see that there's different types of attributes, right, that we can set. So we can set it as active or inactive, and make sure that we actually are monitoring, this specific pattern that we are creating. But we also have other abilities, right? So we can say, should it be an indicator, should it be a warning, should it be an alert, right? So now we can actually raise an alert, and we can even set a severity on this specific alert, right? We set a threshold for this as well. So once this threshold has been exceeded, so if we have more than one occurrence, right, so more than one download, then we would raise a flag and say, hey, we have a download, somebody has done something in the system. And then of course we can put in, how do we want to make this visible to us, right? So once the alert is done, then what do we want to capture, what do we want to see, and how should we group this, right? So we can get a graphical representation of that. So I put in different types of attributes for giving me, let's say, the view that I would like to have. So on one type, side I have the system ID, the acting system ID, and I have the actual host name, right, of the laptop that I'm using, and I'm running this on every 2 seconds, right? So I would get, let's say, a close to real-time notification if I have a data download in the system, and I put this as a very high. All right, so those would be, let's say, my initial settings, and then I would of course, because I'm looking at a 2-second interval, I could change the time period, right, for selection. So I'm doing that for just a 5-minute range. So what I do is I save my my workspace, because now I've created a pattern. I believe that pattern was going to give me some information, and depending on how this is structured within a company, you can have different people with access to different types of workspaces. So you can kind of divide and conquer and say, maybe this group of people, they can look at these patterns, and another group of people can look at other patterns, and so forth, right? So you have that capability as well. So this is just to create a placeholder within enterprise threat detection, so that we can kind of group certain types of patterns in a certain way with certain types of workspaces. So now we come to the next part, right? So the data extraction. So what happens if, for instance, a hacker logs onto the system? So we'll just show you a very simple one. So here we have a supposedly hacker. I'm not going to show you how to hack SAP per se, but let's say that he goes in and he executes a command in the system. Now, what he wants to do is he might want to jump right from one system to the other. He might do an RFC call right to a certain system and extract data from that system. So that's typically, what the pattern would look like, that you have somebody entering a non-productive system, maybe a sandbox, and from there manages to get access to a productive system, and from there he would then pick out a set of tables that he feels is valuable, right? So I'm looking at the USR02 table because we know that that holds user information and maybe even some password hashes and stuff like that. But anyway, once he defines that this is the system he wants to get access to, he tries with the user ID that he's actually compromised on one system, and maybe that doesn't work, so maybe he tries with SAP star, and then he logs onto the system, and then extracts the entries. So you can see that there's 44 entries here. We can even see what the data looks like. But once we have that information and he downloads that to the system, enterprise threat detection will then be able to pick this activity up, right? So that's the whole idea, just to show you what is it that actually triggers enterprise threat detection, and what do we capture, right, for this specific task. Now we go into kind of how do we detect the alert in enterprise threat detection. So you can see up in the top left here, we have 2 alerts that has been raised, right, as very high, because I've run this before as well. But we have the alert ID, we have the pattern that we've just executed, and then we can see that the host name, this initiator, is actually my laptop ID. There's a system ID, which is ERP001. So we actually have at least some information about it already in the current review that we are looking at, and we can see that the alert correctly has been raised as a very high. All right, so let's go in and actually see what are the details behind that, and what type of information do we have, right, from the actual download. So what we can see here is kind of the relationship between the pattern that we have, right? So the data download, and what have kind of contributed to this. So who are the people involved, right? So on one side we have the system, we have the pseudonymized user, as we talked about earlier, and we have the actual host name, right? So we can see that all these different components kind of added to this pattern and are, let's say, culprits, right, in this. So the data download involved a system, right, that was data was downloaded from a desktop or a laptop from where the execution was launched, and then the user, of course, that's launching that specific activity. Now, when we have the view of the alert, we can go into even more details around it, right? So we can see the actual pattern that has been executed, and then we have the triggering events as well as the related events. And we can even see the affected systems and so forth. So these are just the, let's say, the related events, right, that has happened. So we can see, the user, right, and we can see the systems. We can even see the actual transaction codes and so forth, right, from the log events that has been created. And then, of course, we need to be able to report this back to our stakeholders, right? Which could be done, for instance, with digital boardroom. So in this case, it's just a screenshot that I put in for a digital boardroom where we're actually looking at, what are the different alerts, what has been raised, which ones are the open investigations. We can even do a drill down, right, of the different alerts to get even more information around that. But we need to be able to capture this and show that to our stakeholders that yes, we have alerts happening, and these has been raised by, for instance, enterprise threat detection, and we can put those into a context in terms of what type of alerts, what's the let's say average cost or risk, right? And we can react on that, and we can even look at it from different subsidiaries or parts of the business. So where do these type of attacks occur? Is it within a certain specific geographic location? Is it within a certain business process, and so forth, right? And what does the alerts come up with? So just an example of what could be put into a kind of reporting visualization that could potentially be looked at from board level. Then, of course, we need to link this to our risk management solution, right? So what types of risk are we monitoring? And once we have these risks, let's say, identified, then, if one of them are the risk of being, let's say, cyber attacks, right? Or we have a suspicious download or whatever, we would then be able to monitor that, and we can even link that to how enterprise threat detection is generating these alerts. So we would create a risk for that, and we would look at what are the different let's say impacts, and what are the different drivers for this specific risk, and then once we have that defined as well, we can actually go in and say, well, what would be an indicator for something to actually happen in the system, right? So we have we need to have an owner, right, for the specific risk, to say, well, if something happens, I take responsibility. We can have key risk indicators, so we can look at maybe if data breaches has happened in the system, or if we have certain types of data downloads, then how would we actually want to react? Because now we have these things happening, we are receiving that information from enterprise threat detection, and then based on our let's say risk assessment, right, or analysis, we would be looking at whether or not this would actually have an impact on our finances. It would have an impact on our overall risk level in terms of what would be acceptable. And then, of course, we can look at responses as well, and say, well, what measures do we have in place, right? That could be mitigating controls. So, for instance, here we have a control that has been set up in terms of giving access or restricting access to certain sensitive data, or we even put up monitoring of certain types of activities. We can even do anomaly detection, right? So we can look at what is actually normal behavior and how do we assess that going forward, right? So if a system all of a sudden starts talking to another system, we can raise that as an alert so we can investigate it. It might not be wrong, right? But at least we get the early notification if something is happening that we can actually react on it. We transfer the logs immediately, right? Because this is SAP, so that means that SAP logs will actually be almost present at the same time as they've been written into enterprise threat detection, which is why we can do, let's say, the triggering. So if the event happens, you will get the alert almost immediately. We can also propagate these alerts into other CM solutions, right? Or even get these solutions to feed enterprise threat detection. So that would be stuff like QRadar, ArcSight, Splunk, and so forth, right? So we are very much, we complement these solutions at SAP solutions. So where do we go from here? I think, the whole idea was to make sure that you understand that SAP helps build the digital trust, right? We have the two-factor authentication, we have the single sign-on solution, we can actually heighten the security overall, but more so we have an approach, right, to protect the data and ensure that you get the early warning when it comes to cyber attacks. So that was it for now for the short session on cybersecurity. Thank you for attending this session on cybersecurity. I hope you enjoyed it and that it was useful and that you can bring something back to your company. If you have any questions, feel free to ask those in the chat below, and I will be joining you and answering questions later. Or we can schedule a meeting anytime. Thank you very much.